Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Carlos Perez, and I've got some students with me today and some special speakers. So, Kristen, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, so welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for this very important webinar on suicide prevention. We're honored to have two special guests today from NSU who bring a wealth of experience and commitment to mental health and safety within our communities. So first we have Dr. Hubbard, who is a licensed psychologist serving as a postdoctoral resident within the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office here at NSU. Dr. Hubbard work is dedicated to advancing prevention strategies as well as supporting individuals impacted by these critical issues. And then we also have Dr. Poland, who is the professor as well as the director of Suicide and Violence Prevention Office here at NSU. Dr. Poland is internationally recognized as an expert in school safety, suicide prevention, bullying, and crisis intervention. He has over 2 decades of leadership experience and numerous publications, including the suicide prevention toolkits that multiple states use. He's also testified before the US Congress for children's mental health needs and also has served as the NASP president. So, with that, all these great two experts that we have, please join me in welcoming both Dr. Hubbard and Dr. Poland.
And a quick little introduction. Naomi Green is joining us, and she's going to be helping behind the scenes. And with that, I'm going to turn off my camera. And again, welcome Juliet, Dr. Hubbard, and Dr. Poland.
Well, thank all of you for attending today. And Dr. Hubbard and I will be going back and forth. I'm pretty sure that I'm not the only person on this webinar that lost a loved one to suicide. If you lost a loved one to suicide, I think I have a pretty good idea of what you've gone through. And, most suicide prevention in this country is actually driven by us survivors. We don't want to give up. I lost my dad to suicide when I was about 25. Frankly, he exhibited warning signs. I just didn't know them. And it is so important that we cover the warning signs. And I just believe strongly most suicides can be prevented. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll have some questions for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office. So, Juliet, do you want to tell them about what we do in SVP?
Yes, and it couldn't come at a better time because this is Suicide Prevention Month. So we do a lot of things at SVP. Our biggest focus is community outreach. So both in and outside of the university, we do fundraisers, participate in community walks like the upcoming Out of Darkness Walk, the NAMI Health Walks. We disseminate a newsletter about once a semester where we try to keep everyone up to date on news regarding suicide and violence prevention. We present a lot of interdisciplinary education. So we have presented for teachers, for guidance counselors. We present for our physician students, our MDs and our DOs, because we really believe that cross collaboration is key in suicide prevention. And we have a lot of involvement in different organizations that are all working towards that goal of suicide prevention. So we do things with our Broward branch of the United Way, and we also do some work with some peer-to-peer suicide prevention programs, such as the Hope Squad, which is stationed up in Utah, but which is now a national program. So those are just a few of the things that we do. Let me move us forward here.
One of the key things is that we must talk about suicide more, what to look for and what to do. That was actually a statement from our Surgeon General, who said, we got to talk about suicide prevention in our homes, our schools, the workplace, and the places of worship. So there you see some rather sad statistics about suicide being pretty close to an all-time high in the United States. And of course, the data is always going to be a couple years behind. But if you want to keep up on this data, save.org, which is the Suicide Awareness Voices and Education, has the most updated information.
Yes. And there is our overview of SVP. Did you want to talk a little bit about your brother's call?
Yes. You know, I have a rich older brother. He owns several homes. One of those is on Marco Island. And last year, when it was snowbird time to come to Florida, my brother called me and he was like really upset. And I was like, Steve, what is it? He said, my neighbor Brian, he was seen in the parking lot yesterday holding a gun to his head. Well, Steve, did they rush Brian to the emergency room? No, they didn't. Well, do you know, does he still have that gun available? Well, you know, I asked his wife about that. She said I couldn't possibly take away my husband's gun. And then my own brother said, but what good would that do? He would just find another way, right? But the literature actually emphasizes that removing lethal means may be the single greatest strategy we have to prevent a suicide. Then I asked a little bit more about Brian. And my brother said, well, he's really struggling with Parkinson's disease. Well, I have a theory here. I bet he's being treated for Parkinson's, but not the accompanying depression. You know, I'm really proud of my brother. He actually went with Brian to Brian's doctor, and Brian shared his suicidal behavior. And Brian is getting counseling. He's still struggling with Parkinson's, but he is still with us. But it is so important that we remove lethal means.
And we'll talk more about that because I know that's something that we return to. But just talking a little bit about sort of the underlying reasons why this happens. Um, it's complicated for every individual, and I don't want to oversimplify it because I think every person who has struggled with this has, they've gone down a long road. But we do know that two of the biggest factors we find are that is often the result of untreated or undertreated mental illness. There are usually also adverse childhood experiences, and of course, we're always on the lookout for those precipitating events, which are the things that happen, the kind of the triggering events. A lot of times it's a relationship conflict, it may be financial troubles, it may be legal troubles, or it may be medical.
You know, now that you've mentioned medical, again, I meant to say a moment ago something that we both know, which is about 70% of the time, the person of any age who died by suicide actually saw their family physician not long before their death. And that's why we are so proud here at NSU. We get to actually train all of our medical students. And our greatest hope is that the next generation of physicians would be a lot more comfortable directly addressing suicide with patients.
Now, I know we also have Dr. Poland, you have a lot of experience with youth suicide.
Well, yes. And what I really believe strongly is that, first of all, we got to train all school staff about what to look for, what to do. What are the warning signs? Don't keep a secret about suicidal behavior of a student. And their parents must be informed, and we need to get the needed resources. But once we've done all that, there are programs out there that are designed to help students know how to help their friends. And I wish that every student graduating from high school would have been trained on their important role in suicide prevention. And, you know, when we get new students here, I always like to ask them, you know, did they receive suicide prevention awareness training in high school? And the answer is almost always no.
Yes. So I think Morgan, Kristen, or Naomi, could one of you, we have a question that I really do want to answer. I think we're going to be holding questions until the end, but Gregory, we want to come back to that. Um, So we have an opening question for you though. What age groups are most at risk for suicide? Please just throw some answers in the chat.
Oh, great. I can see some of the answers here. And I'd like to just sketch out the problem of suicide across ages. Good news, it's incredibly rare under the age of 11. However, having said that, I've responded to suicides of kids as young as the age of 9. So we know it can happen. And around the world, I'm hearing from elementary school counselors, more and more 4th and 5th graders are talking about suicide, and we have to take it seriously. But it is the second leading cause of death for middle schoolers. So Jessica is right on with that. It's the third leading cause of death for high school students. Then it's the second leading cause of death for college students. And we're really sorry to share with you that the psychology program, we lost a student to suicide 2 years ago. And NSU, like many universities, has lost students to suicide. Suicide rate does go down for young Americans in at least 30s and 40s, but then it goes up again pretty dramatically. And you're actually looking at the highest risk category in America. That would be an old white man. If we have family health and financial problems, we are very much at risk. And in the middle age group, we're also very concerned about suicide for our active duty military as well as our veterans. But when somebody basically said all, that was actually a pretty good answer in terms of concern across all ages about suicidal behavior. And I think we have another question for them.
Let's take a look. Yes.
So what states out there in the US have the highest suicide rates?
I see. I see 2 for Alaska, northern states, isolated areas, rural areas. Some votes for
Okay.
southern, midwestern.
So I don't want to oversimplify, but basically all the states in the East have lower suicide rates, with states like Maryland, New York, New Jersey having like the lowest in the nation. So what are the states with the highest rates? Alaska, Montana, Wyoming. Pretty much every Western state except California. We could spend a lot of time on this, but what is it about Alaska, Montana, Wyoming? You might be thinking rural nature. You might be thinking the availability of guns. You might be thinking lack of mental health services nearby. You might be thinking higher percentage of Native Americans. Those are all factors, absolutely. And isolation, yes, not to mention seasonal affective disorder in places like Alaska. But maybe at the simplest level, the research is pointing to common sense about guns in eastern states versus the availability of so many guns in western states. But there are other factors too. I think we have one more question for them.
Yes, we do. By race and gender, who is the most protected against suicide? I know we talk a lot about those are at risk, but from the research, we know that protective factors are very important as well. So we always like to include a couple of questions about this in addition. Let's see. Black women, Hispanic women, upper class, white men, Hispanic. Seeing a lot of range of answers.
So very exciting to me to see some of our former students that are on this webinar, Black women. And then the question would really be, why is it that Black females have lower suicide rates? And the literature is going to point to sisterhood, faith, and purpose. And maybe we should all take a lesson from Black women and having stronger support systems. So, okay, and moving on, what do we have next for them? Juliet, do you want to comment on these national strategies?
So I can talk a little bit about our national strategies for suicide prevention. Now, of course, these are something that are always subject to change. They're things that we try, but we're looking at specific actions that we're trying to undertake across agencies. And again, that multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary collaboration is so important. So we're looking at some of the unique challenges because social media, the pandemic, and disparities among various populations has sort of changed the landscape in suicide prevention. And a couple of things that we look at is when you really drill down in that information, um, sometimes the overall data that you look at can kind of mask some things that are very important. So, for example, when you look at the youth suicide rate among adolescents, overall it went down, which I think, we're all looking at that thinking, great, this is good. But if you look at it broken down based on demographics, that overall decline masked a rise in suicide among our youth of color. So we were seeing more suicides among African American males, Hispanic males. So there was a rise there that is really concerning to us. Which brings us to our next point. We really want to be able to identify some of those high risk groups. So we know it's youth, veterans, are individuals who are identifying under that LGBTQ plus umbrella, racial minorities, um, and talking a little bit about those demographics that have increased dramatically. So again, this is that comprehensive approach that we're thinking about because in order for us to be successful, we all kind of need to be on the same page. And I think that it seems very complex on the surface, but when you look into it, there's a big agreement on the fact that being able to ask directly, knowing the warning signs, and being able to foster connection and connect people to the needed supports is really key for however you find yourself interacting with individuals who are struggling with suicidal ideation. I always sort of tell this to students as they first come in, even when I'm working with students who are not necessarily in the psychology program. I just ask, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a teacher? Do you want to be a police officer? Do you want to be a lawyer? And then I help them make that connection between what they want to do and how they can take action when they're interacting with people who are struggling.
One point I think we need to stop and talk about that's on this slide. LGBTQ plus individuals. There's nothing inherently suicidal about their orientation. It's about crap and rejection that they may be getting in their lives. So the Trevor Project in particular has great resources, but also has some really sobering data about the percentage of the time that these individuals take suicidal action. So we need to all do everything we can to embrace them in our society.
Absolutely. So what we're looking at, these 4 strategic areas. The first one is community-based suicide prevention. So I know that, a lot of these times our Out of Darkness Walk, our NAMI Health Walks are a great way of bringing together different prevention resources. So definitely look for a walk in your area because that can help you become, if you're looking to get more involved in suicide prevention, that is a way to understand what is out there local to us. We have FISP that has suicide that has services and support for suicide survivors. And we also have the United Way of Broward branch, which is doing some incredible things. And, NOVA tries to get involved with kind of everything related to suicide prevention. So knowing what's available in the community, because we really want to make sure that we connect people to those resources, which brings us to treatment and crisis services. So knowing what's available at a lot of different levels. Knowing, of course, anyone who is struggling and in crisis can go to the emergency room. But I find myself very often telling people about things like a mobile crisis unit that can be called out to help, places, hospitals that have a receiving center for individuals where they can triage and do some of that work. And making sure people know even what less intensive supports are available, support groups, mental health resources. So making sure that we're aware of those and that we're helping to connect people. Surveillance, quality improvement, and research. I know there was a question about this because there is, something called a psychological autopsy where we look at people who have died by suicide and we kind of try to figure out what led them there, what were the resources that were missing, and giving us more information on who we need to reach and how we can expand our services. We have had some projects like that in Florida. I don't know if for those of you who are abroad, but recently there was a law passed about protecting the information of individuals who had died by suicide. And I think that lost us some connections to the medical examiner's office and made it a little bit harder. So I think right now, we want to get involved in that qualitative research, but we're still figuring out how to get those alternative streams of data. And so that's a huge, I think, setback sometimes in suicide prevention is that we want to protect people who are struggling with this, but it can be hard to collect the data that we need sometimes because it is still such a stigmatized um, thing that happens. But however we can, we try to do that. And go ahead, Scott, you were going to say something?
Yes, losing a loved one to suicide has been called the most complicated grief there is. And I still remember going to the first general loss group after the death of my father. We went around the group and somebody lost their mom to cancer. Somebody's twin brother died in a car accident. And I say, well, my dad shot himself. I felt like I wasn't in the right place. And I think it's important for all of us to help those that lost a loved one to suicide to get in suicide survivor support groups, which are offered right here in Broward County. The Lost Team, Florida Initiative for Suicide Prevention. But that's what I've found really helped people who lost a loved one to suicide. Be with others that experienced that same complicated loss.
And the last thing I'm going to try to say quickly is looking at health equity and suicide prevention. So, I don't know if any of you have heard of the author Craig Bryan. He wrote an amazing book called Rethinking Suicide. And he says that it's not enough just to stop someone from dying by suicide. We have to help them create lives that are worth living. And I think that goes a lot to this part of health equity and suicide prevention is that we need to help people solve. We know things like health issues, financial issues, legal issues. We know those are all risk factors. So promoting access to health services equity is really critical and key to suicide prevention. So over and above the crisis services and the mental health resources that happen in the immediate moment, we need to be looking at that building a life worth living piece.
So quality of life, Juliet, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I want to take a moment and give an example because it has so many important points. But the security guard at the condo where we lived at Hollywood Beach, man named Bob, nice guy. Was he our close friend? No, but we saw him every night. He worked 11 to 7. We were always taking our dogs out about the time he arrived for work. We usually saw him every morning before he left. And by the way, Bob really liked flirting with my wife. That was okay with me. But Bob in particular really loved our dogs. And he really made over those dogs. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that Bob fell and broke his hip away from work. So that meant he couldn't come back to work. He didn't have workman's compensation, and he wanted to come back to work, but the condo board said, "Oh no, you're night security. You can't come back in a walker." Well, we reached out to Bob and we talked to him on the phone. We wanted to come visit him, but he wouldn't let us. I did learn that he lived in one of those apartments that you rent by the week, and I think he was kind of embarrassed about where he lived. Also learned that he couldn't have a dog, and it was really a motel that you rent by the week. He couldn't have a dog. And we wanted to bring him food. He wouldn't let us. My wife's talking to him about services and help in Broward County. But on one of those conversations, he shared what he had to live on. Bob, a guy about my age, had Social Security that paid him $1,100 a month. You can't live in South Florida on $1,100 a month. And on one conversation, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "I wish I could come live on your balcony." I just didn't understand the desperation. And we had no idea Bob owned a gun. Looking back on it, I should have realized his desperation. I should have asked him directly about a method. Bob shot himself. And, when we interviewed Craig Bryan, Rethinking Suicide, for our newsletter, everything about what Craig Bryan is saying about quality of life, Bob just didn't have it. And how can we provide that for all Americans, and especially elderly Americans? Because I think that would dramatically reduce the suicide rate.
Absolutely. So now that we're on the subject of some of our interviews, Dr. Poland, would you like to share some about some of the other interviews we've had in our newsletters?
Yes, I would. And I know Dr. Berman personally, a giant in the field of suicide prevention. I mean, he has written so much and had so many leadership positions, but at the simplest level, he's saying, we don't fund suicide prevention. We don't put the money to do something about it that we do to try to prevent other leading causes of death of Americans. And, we also interviewed Dr. Joyner. And Dr. Joyner says, suicide isn't cowardly. Suicide is fearless. You're overcoming the most basic instinct that we all have, which is to stay alive. And I'm afraid that many of the people making the decisions about funding are thinking that they're cowards. They should have been able to manage whatever it was and go on with their life. And there you see some other comments from Dr. Joyner about potentially the mistakes we make. And being involved in a number of legal cases, it's like we need written safety plans developed jointly with our clients. We need to be revisiting suicide and their thoughts frequently. We need to keep careful documentation and make sure we don't underestimate the risk factors and overestimate the protective factors. And, the previous slide, if you'd go back one, Juliet, we also interviewed Dr. Anestis, who wrote the book Guns and Suicide. And he's echoing something we already talked about today. But here's the bottom line. Guns are used in only 5% of suicide attempts. They result in slightly more than 50% of suicide deaths. You don't get a second chance very often if you attempt with a gun. And that means for all of us that work with clients, we need to be very direct in finding out the method they're thinking of and taking steps to try to remove that method. And then the next slide has our interview that we did with Dr. David Jobs. And, I think the average person out there would believe, hey, if I go see a a licensed professional counselor, a licensed social worker, a licensed psychologist, they're all going to know suicide risk assessment and management, right? Well, the problem is it's not really required. I'm looking at my Texas license. I have been licensed for 42 years as a psychologist in Texas. I've never had to take one single CEU hour on suicide risk assessment and management. So largely what that means for all of us is we got to seek it out on our own, because it may not have been part of your coursework. It may not have been part of practicum or internship. Maybe it was, and that would be great. But I truly wish that every state licensing board would require some continuing education on the topic.
Absolutely. So a couple of the quotes we've already talked about. Goal is helping people build lives worth living, but also understanding suicide as a wicked problem. So understanding that there are lots of different factors, other than the big ones we mentioned, that can contribute. But as kind of hopefully pointed out by Dr. Brian, this also means that very small changes can lead to big results. So if there are lots of different factors which are contributing, there are lots of opportunities for us to intervene and to help. Um, and we've talked a little bit about Joyner, and the reason why Joyner is one of the people we go back to, why we interview him, why we talk about his theories a lot in our newsletter, is because he has come up with one of the most well-researched, well-validated, and I think very easy to understand models of suicide risk. And so what Joyner kind of says is that suicide occurs when these three factors are in play. So the first two, perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness, contribute to the desire to die. But they're not deadly unless you have that third factor, which is the acquired capacity for suicide. Like Dr. Poland says, our instinct to survive is the oldest and strongest instinct that we have. It is so deeply ingrained that in order to overcome that, to be capable of hurting your own body, requires a process of habituation where you have been exposed to the fear of death, exposed to painful or provocative experiences, and where you have sort of habituated yourself to the point where you can um, enact such lethal injury on your own body. And I think this also brings us to, some of the things that we talk about when we're talking about recent concerns with social media, is that a lot of those painful experiences, the exposure to things like self-harm, to glorified descriptions of suicide attempts, to information that is potentially deadly, is so accessible. And it's so easy to kind of be re-exposed to that and have that mental habituation. So that's one of the things that I always think about when we talk about the social media piece.
You know, what's important for us to cover, what the World Organization say works to prevent suicide. And I think we have really covered the first and the third point quite well. But of course, with young people, there's what's called ACEs. And, there's like the top 10 adverse childhood experiences, and a lot of research out there indicating when a kid has 3 or 4 or more of those, how difficult their life is and the lack of hope. But anything we can do to reduce adverse childhood experiences, and at least one of those is bullying. And I've been involved in a number of lawsuits where the kid died by suicide. And by the way, that term is important. When we rephrase it as died by, and don't put the word committed with this topic, that's a lot more acceptable to us survivors. What the parents say, we put the school on notice that kid was being bullied, they didn't do anything about it, and our child died by suicide. Now, to date, not a single court has found the school district liable in those cases. But one that I was involved in, settled out of court for $9.1 million. And that's going to fuel a lot more lawsuits. So what do I want you to remember? If you're working with a young person and you know they're the victim of bullying, please don't hesitate to ask them questions about hopelessness, giving up, and thoughts of suicide.
And so, of course, there are the common suicide warning signs that we should all be trained to look for. So, any statements or communication about death, dying, or suicide, verbal or written. I've even seen teachers bring me sort of artistic depictions of things that were concerning to them that they wanted me to look at, and I'm always grateful that they do that. Statements about hopelessness and despair and feeling trapped. So I often see these on social media, and a lot of times peers are the one who bring these statements to my attention, which I think is fantastic. I love when friends are looking out for each other. I think it makes me, feel like we're doing something right. Giving away prized possessions, making out a will, any of those things that sort of indicate kind of like end of life planning or dramatic changes in behavior. And this is, I think, where a point that I always underscore to my teachers, your students, you've had them in your class for a year, you probably know them better than I do. You're the best one to tell me if this behavior that you're seeing is a big departure from how they usually are. Some of the warning signs you'll find are like anxious and irritable behavior, and those are important, but it's also important to remember that those things are sometimes common in kids. Kids are anxious, but a teacher, someone who knows the kid, a teacher, a parent, a friend is going to be able to tell me, this anxiety has gotten worse. This irritability has gotten worse. This is a big change for this person. And most individuals who died by suicide exhibited one or more of these warning signs. So just being on the lookout and being able to identify and feeling comfortable in asking and reporting what you see is really key.
Juliet, my dad told me he didn't want to live to be an old man. I just didn't get it. I would give anything to have that last conversation back. I should have just asked him directly. Are you telling me you're thinking about killing yourself? Is that it? And at least I would have had the opportunity to try to do something to help him. So it's critical that everybody knows these warning signs.
Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about means restriction, and I also just want to sort of highlight that, when you're working in a mental health field, we know that we're aware enough to know that sometimes the idea of means restriction can be very divisive. It can be something that puts people on guard. So we always really highlight something called CALM, which is counseling access to lethal means, because it is not about questioning anyone's right to own or have a firearm for protection, hunting, whatever they choose to have it for. It's about making sure that it's safely secured, that it's restricted, that it's contained, that it's safe, so that in a moment of crisis it is not immediately available. And I think there are ways to do that, and that are acceptable to people, and that increases our chances of being successful in making sure that guns are out of the hands of someone who shouldn't have them in that moment.
CALM is available at the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. And there it is again.
Mhm. So another question, what protects against suicide? Just throw some answers in the chat. There are lots of good ones to choose from. I've seen tons of great ones. Social connectedness, awareness, family, faith, support, resources. Oh, pets. I love that one. Yes, absolutely. For a lot of people, something to live for and something that needs you to feed it every day, like a pet, is an amazing protective factor.
Particularly the Center for Disease Control really zeroed in on connections, people being connected to their family, their neighborhood, their church, their school, their place of work.
Absolutely. So those are all fantastic answers. And here they are: connections, coping and problem solving, services, knowing when to seek help, lack of access to lethal weapons. So some of the challenges I think we've already talked about is that lack of resources. I think someone pointed out prevention is hard to quantify sometimes if something doesn't happen. So a lot of times it gets defunded. There's also, we talked about roadblocks to sort of collecting the data that we need to quantify it. So absolutely. And a lot of times we do have a strain on the system because there aren't enough mental health professionals. Uh, the stigma, I know we've talked about the stigma as well. And that I think leads into the reason why we don't know the warning signs and why we're afraid to act. Because if we're not talking about it, the information that gets spread around tends to be misinformation. That's one of the other reasons that I'm really grateful that we do these Shark Chats, that we do our best to spread this information around. And we also talked about the requirements. Scott, did you want to add anything about challenges?
I think this pretty well spells it out, and I know we want to leave some time for questions, but I think
Yes.
every point that's on that slide is absolutely critical for prevention.
Absolutely. So some of that misinformation we usually work to try to dispel. I think there's lots of different myths about suicide, but these are some of the big ones. Um, a lot of people will talk about suicide as an impulsive act. So there is a relationship between sort of that problem solving skills and impulsivity and its relationship to suicide, but it's much more complicated than it is on the surface. And in general, suicide does not happen on a whim or without warning. I would venture to say almost never. Um, so framing it as something that we can prevent, that has warning signs, that has opportunities to intervene is important. It is not inherited or destined. Having a family member die by suicide does not mean that that is your fate, that is your destiny. Again, that goes to helping people to understand that this is preventable, that there are things we can do. Talking about suicide is not going to plant the idea in someone's head. This is something we always come up with when we're training our new psychologists, because it can be so uncomfortable for them to ask directly for the first time, but really reassuring them that if someone is showing all the signs and you ask, a lot of people who feel this way have thought of hurting or even killing themselves. Have you had those thoughts? That's not suggesting it to them. That's opening the doorway for them to unburden themselves. And we've talked a little bit about bullying and also the relationship between suicide and self-injury. So again, if you think of Joyner's model, that self-injury is one of the ways in which people habituate to hurting their own body. So even when you have people who talk about self-injury, and I have a lot of adolescents who will swear up and down to me that it is not about trying to hurt themselves or trying to kill themselves. I know that it's a risk factor, so it's always something we follow up on. Okay. So following up that, here are some of the things to do. And Scott, you've had a lot of experience with this, so maybe you can run down with some key points that people should consider.
Well, I think it's really important that we get comfortable with asking the direct questions, and we like to demonstrate here through role play. We like to have people practice, but the key thing is really to be a good listener and be there for that person, and let them know that right now that person in front of you is the only person in the world that matters. And we can't be dismissive. We can't give them a pep talk. We need to really help them work through everything that's happening in their lives that is causing them to think that suicide is the only way out. It's been said that an individual who's suicidal has like tunnel vision, constriction. They want what they perceive as unendurable pain to end. And two words that I almost never use are I understand, but it's like, help me to understand what's going on in your life.
And that gives them a lot of opportunity to disclose the things that are going on with them. And so these are also the key points. Whenever someone says that they are considering suicide, we take it seriously, we stay with them, help them remove lethal means, and give them some resources of who they can talk to. There's talk lines, there's text lines. 988 has made it very easy to remember the phone numbers and escort them to mental health services. Also, in cases where you can encourage them to help you connect them and share this information with family, anyone who can really support them through this. I know when you're talking about young people, it's always um, it is imperative and it is necessary and it is absolutely not discretionary that we inform the parents, no matter how much they may not like that fact. Sometimes it is life saving to make sure that they are with people who can help keep them safe. Other ways to help. So we've talked a lot about our walks: advocate, connect, volunteer, walk. Any place that you can sort of get involved, whether that's advocating for funding, participating in fundraising, helping to disseminate the information, or even just coming to talks like this to make sure that you have more information so that you can share that. I think all of that is contributing to that collaborative suicide prevention that we need. Well, do we have time for this? I think we do.
So this is a young man, maybe a high school senior, maybe a freshman in college. Look like they're dressed up, but they just banged their head against the mirror. Ever since the breakup, I haven't been able to study. I just found out I'm losing my job. I'm not sure I want to live anymore. Please take a moment and put something in the chat. How do you really wish every American could respond to this young man?
I think that there is hope. Here, talk to me. Yes, absolutely. Tell me more about it. Do you have time to talk? Yeah, those are all wonderful. And if you're ever feeling stuck, the JED Foundation has a wonderful campaign called Seize the Awkward that I like referring people to because they have nice conversation starters. If you're running out of language, you can always borrow theirs. It's a really wonderful campaign. Help me understand.
Juliet, I'm glad you mentioned the JED Foundation because our university is working with the JED Foundation about college mental health and prevention. And Juliet and I are both on the university-wide committee.
Yes.
So these are great answers. Let's show them the next slide.
Yes. So probably said something like this, and I think most of you did. You are in pain and overwhelmed. Are you thinking of suicide? So making sure we do that direct asking. If so, you're not the first person to have these thoughts, and there's help available. I'm here for you.
You know, this is just the most basic thing that we wish every American could do. Ask these questions, stay with the person. I'm here for you. We're going to get you help.
Yes.
That's what we need.
And if you're looking for more information on how to do this, I know that free QPR training is also offered online. It takes about an hour. It's really helpful. You can just look for QPR training near me. And absolutely, Gregory said you don't have to be a licensed professional to support somebody, which I think is in, very true. We all have the capability to foster that connection and help keep someone safe.
So we already talked a little bit about helping the survivors of suicide, but one of the things that changed pretty dramatically is we didn't recognize some years ago how many people on average are affected by a suicide. And everybody always has these if only thoughts. If only I'd done this, if only I'd recognized that. And what I have found really helps survivors is get involved in prevention. Get involved with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have chapters all over the country. Get involved, raise money, raise awareness.
Yes, Absolutely. And so here are some final thoughts. It's a critical time for everyone to have this knowledge and to share it, knowing about how we can help make someone's life worth living and not being afraid to ask. And now I think we are just about at the point where we were going to hold for questions. So if there are any questions that we didn't already cover, anything you want us to go deeper into, please just put it in the chat and let us know.
And we do recommend the Suicide Safe mobile app from SAMHSA.
Yes.
As it has the Columbia, it has the Safe-T, it has case studies, and it can really help you feel more empowered to work with suicidal clients.
Yes, and the Columbia, can you go more into the NSSI behaviors? So I can talk a little bit about that. So when I'm not doing webinars and working on this aspect of things, I am over in a school. I do see a lot of different self-harm behaviors. They can sort of range. We see cutting, burning, hitting, any kind of self-harm. Um, the thing about it is that there are a lot of adolescents who engage in this not with the intention to die. However, as we stated before, that's contributing to their ability to cause themselves lethal self-injury if and when that desire to die develops. And also, some of the key factors that we're seeing that lend additional concern is if you have a student who is escalating the behavior, so they're not getting as much pain relief as they were out of the self-harm. It's not accomplishing its goal for them anymore. And if they're doing it in multiple ways, we see we see more risk for those individuals.
You know, it fulfills a multitude of complex need for students engaging it. But one of the issues, of course, it releases endorphins, it regulates emotions, but it's not working as well today as it did months ago. And most of the cases that I know well, ultimately it was a suicide attempt. And then somebody got to the bottom of their long history of self-injury. So something Dr. Hubbard said earlier about we really need to be screening for suicide risk when we know a student is engaging in self-injury as a coping mechanism.
And I did want to address Gregory's question about the suicide autopsy investigation, because I was also part of a project that was trying to get those off the ground in Broward County. We had our students involved, and this is one of the cases where it lost funding. And I think a lot of that was due to some of the difficulties in getting that information due to the passing of the bill, which I forget the number of it at this moment. So, some of our work over the past year has been trying to find opportunities for research, for similar research, not necessarily suicide autopsy investigations, but potentially looking at opportunities for doing focus groups. I know the United Way has a data work group where they are trying to get involved in that. And I know that I've had some conversations with FISP because they have a lot of contact with suicide survivors, um, where they have also been thinking about how they can look at that qualitative data from the groups that they have. Um, but again, it's always a question of where the resource is going to come from and how are we going to get this research off the ground and who's going to be responsible for the internal review board and all of those sort of nitty gritty questions. So I think it's still very much in its infancy. But if you are interested in those kind of opportunities, those are places that I would definitely check with, is seeing what opportunities there are to get involved with United Way. I think Children's Services Council in Broward is also involved in some of, like, they have a branch that's also involved in that, and FISP. So if you're local to the area, that's where I would look. And if you are not, then I would definitely start looking for a United Way in your area.
So earlier we wanted to clarify it's the JED Foundation, JED, started in memory of Jed, who was the University of Arizona student who died by suicide. Yes, we're also big fans of Sandy Hook Promise,
Yes.
founded by parents who lost their children at the shooting at Sandy Hook. They've done a lot with school violence prevention. They also have done a lot with suicide prevention. Sandy Hook Promise, I believe, has touched basically every school in America. There's another question about recommendations for ongoing or follow-up support when students are at moderate risk or not in need of immediate crisis support, like the Baker Act, for example. Well, we've got to get parents to take this seriously. And I've often said something like, it can happen. It has happened. We lost a middle schooler at a nearby school last year. And sometimes it's hard for parents to grasp the severity of this problem. And often they don't follow through with needed community-based mental health services. I mean, the bottom line is we have a national shortage of school mental health personnel. They're spread way too thin. So we have to be careful about the responsibility that a school mental health person might, basically accept. So we really need referral for community-based service. And how do we make that happen for those families that don't have insurance or aren't reasonably affluent? And I know this will be surprising to you, but there are actually school districts in this nation that refer students for community-based providers, and they pay the fees to get them started. That typically only happens when a school district has had multiple suicides. The district I used to work in Texas, I got the superintendent to give me a pretty large pot of money, and we paid for assessments from community-based providers. But at the simplest level, I believe it's negligence not to get help for a suicidal child. And, the last card I have to play with parents is, if you won't take this seriously and get your child help, I'm going to have to call protective services. And the other issue, to be very direct today, is I'm concerned in this area of extreme emphasis on parental permission that a principal is going to say to a school psychologist, oh, you can't even talk to that kid, not unless the parents give us permission. But the kid might be at risk of suicide. And what if the parents say, no, you can't talk to my child? So these are very complicated issues, and trying to get the community services needed for a student who's suicidal and getting the proper response from parents. We've added to our work a suicide proofing the home form, because there are certain things that parents must do to remove lethal means in their home.
Stephanie asked about connection between mindfulness skills in relation to suicidal ideation. I don't have any exact numbers or studies off the top of my head. I know in general, mindfulness has had pretty good results, through some of the dialectical behavior therapy routes. They incorporate that, and it has been very good for individuals who consider suicide or self-harm. I think it's a worthy avenue of research. So I think in general it's pretty good, but like I said, I don't have anything exact. We also had a question about individuals who plan on harming others.
So, and I know we're almost about to run out of time, but there are certainly very definite procedures to assess a threat of violence towards others. And most of those procedures are direct about that. The question we often get is, if a kid's suicidal, should we be screening them for homicide risk as well? And the bottom line is, most suicidal individuals have no thoughts of harming anyone but themselves. But if they're angry at other people, they want to get back at them. Maybe they're the victim of bullying. If they're an adolescent, for example, then we need to screen for both suicide risk and homicide risk. And one question we've been getting, and this is really for Dr. Perez, will they get a copy of this PowerPoint, Dr. Perez?
Hello, Scott. Thanks again for doing this. We really don't have a mechanism to deploy this, so I ask people to view the recording, and it'll be up in 24 hours.
Great. And Dr. Hubbard, you want to show them, don't we have one or two resources slides?
Yes. So we have our nova.edu/suicide prevention, where we have our newsletters, our videos, our toolkit. I think you may need to follow an extra link for the newsletters, but they're still there. Here are some of our resources at NSU, our student care team, our student counseling center, and the Nova Alert hotline. And here are a couple of other resources that you can feel free to share. And of course, if you go back to the beginning, which I don't know if I can get there quickly, I cannot. You have our email, which is svp@nova.edu, and you can always reach out to us there, and either Scott or myself or one of our graduate assistants will read your email and forward it along.
Thank you so much for your attention today on this important topic. And I do believe we can make a difference and reduce the suicide rate in our country by all working together.
Thank you again, Dr. Poland, Dr. Hubbard.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for our guest. And please share these presentations with your friends, family. Nova.edu/shark chats.